Hey everyone, welcome back to TC24, the only channel dedicated to former NBA great Tom Chambers. This is a special podcast episode where I, the curator of TC24, make a case for Tom Chambers' candidacy for the Basketball Hall of Fame on Jim Miloch's Pod of Fame show. Jim's Pod of Fame is an excellent series debating the Hall of Fame candidacies of retired players from Major League Baseball, football, and basketball. Jim and I will discuss the career of Tom Chambers and debate the pros and cons of his Hall of Fame candidacy. Will Jim agree with me that Tom Chambers should get a call from the Hall? Listen in to find out.
The NBA on NBC. The 1998
What is up, everybody? This is Jim Miloch, and you're listening to Pod of Fame, the podcast where we break down the careers of former athletes and decide whether or not they should get a call to the Hall. On today's podcast, we're talking about former NBA power forward Tom Chambers and whether or not he should be in the Basketball Hall of Fame. And joining us in just a moment to discuss Chambers' career and Hall of Fame candidacy is a YouTuber with a channel dedicated to Tom Chambers. He calls himself a Tom Chambers superfan, and that is Jeff Wells. But before I bring Jeff on, let's talk a little more about Tom Chambers. Tom Chambers played from 1981 to 1998, played 16 NBA seasons. And over those 16 seasons, he was a four-time All-Star, a two-time All-NBA second-team member, and of course, won the 1987 All-Star Game MVP. Over those 16 seasons, he averaged 18 points per game, 6 boards, and 2 assists, shooting 47% from the field, 31% from three, and 81% from the free throw line. During his career, he scored 20,049 career points, which is good for 48th all-time in NBA history, and had 6,703 rebounds. Chambers never won a championship, but he did make it to 5 Western Conference Finals and 1 NBA Finals. And in back-to-back Western Conference Finals in 1989 and 1990, he put up some really good performances. In 1989 against the Lakers, he put up 26 points per game, 10 boards, and 4 assists. And in 1990, so the next year they get back there, they versus the Blazers. He averages 25 points per game, 8 boards, and 2 assists. He also had a 60-point game that Jeff and I are going to talk about in just a second. So those are the quick facts about Tom Chambers. Let's bring on Jeff. All right. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast today a YouTuber with a channel dedicated to Tom Chambers, and I would say a Tom Chambers superfan, Jeff Wells. Jeff, how are you doing today?
Great, Jim. Anytime I can have an audience and talk about Tom Chambers and his career, it's a great day for me. Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. So, Jeff, before we get into our segments today, before we talk about the Hall of Fame candidacy, the career of Tom Chambers, who of course played, from 1981 to 1998, had a nice lengthy career in the NBA. Before we start talking about him, all the segments, I got to know, and my listeners, I want them to know as well. You have this channel on YouTube, TC24. You are a Tom Chambers superfan. I was talking to you about this before the show, but I know MJ superfans. I know Kobe superfans. They're everywhere. LeBron superfans. I do not know any other Tom Chambers superfans. How did you become a Tom Chambers superfan? Also, what inspired you to create this channel on YouTube?
Yeah, there are not many Tom Chambers superfans out there. I'm aware of it. He deserves to have an advocate in his corner. I've been a fan of his for 37, 38 years. And despite me being located in LA, I grew up with the Showtime Lakers. They were my favorite team. Tom Chambers, when he was playing with the Seattle Supersonics, really impressed me with his playing style and abilities. And I started following him probably mid-'80s or so. And he really just caught my imagination. He kind of became a player avatar for me because I was into basketball myself. And I saw a lot in him of what I wanted to be as a player. I was a little tall for my size. I was athletic. And he kind of set a template for me And when YouTube came along and the internet came along, I'm a little bit older generation. I saw the opportunity on YouTube to maybe showcase a little bit of Chambers with some highlights. And I knew nothing about video editing at the time. I had a couple of clips. A buddy of mine helped me digitize them and threw them up on YouTube. And this is when YouTube was brand new. This is like YouTube Stone Age, 2006. I uploaded a handful of videos, just short clips, and they got an audience response. And it was encouraging to me that there were other fans I could share my passion for Chambers with, but I lacked the editing abilities. I knew I was not very tech savvy. I was pretty much a tech Luddite. About 10 years or so went by, and I think it was 2018. I'm looking at I think it was a 2018 list of Hall of Fame nominees. And once again, Tom Chambers was not on that list. And that kind of set a burning fire in me that I'm going to do this YouTube channel again, and I'm going to learn video editing. I put myself to that task single-mindedly, learned video editing on my own, bought the equipment, did the online tutorials, and started making videos on Tom Chambers regularly in 2018. And it's really trying to become a library to showcase his career on that channel. Complete games, mixtapes, feature stories. So that's the evolution of how I became a Tom Chambers fan, why the channel, what I'm doing on there now.
Well, I mean, that all sounds great and it makes sense. And, you're a YouTube pioneer, it sounds like, if you're way back when doing. And again, I've seen your channel. I saw your videos. That's actually how I came across you to bring you on. Cause I told you before, we were looking for someone to come on for Tom Chambers. And I was actually researching another episode for some other player that played in the 80s, came across your channel, watched a few videos, and I thought the work you did was great, and I wanted to bring you on to talk about him. So I'm glad you started the channel. That's what got you here on the podcast today. And Jeff, you kind of just talked about your fandom of Chambers and how you got to create this YouTube channel. My first segment is always, I ask the guest, when you think of this player, and I feel like you have this channel, you think about him all the time, but if someone were to kind of catch you off guard and in a bar, restaurant, ask you, bring up Tom Chambers in a conversation, I guess, Jeff, what's the first thing that would come across your mind when you're thinking of Tom Chambers?
There isn't one singular thing. It's sort of a collage of mental images, but I think of him in this form of a whirling dervish of a big man, his exceptional agility and speed in the open court for his size. He was such an athletic big for his time. He was really unique, a terrific dunker. And he would love to come down on the wing and finish that fast break with a two-hand power dunk, often rising, head level to the rim, cocking the ball back with two hands and flushing it through in one motion. I believe he led the league for a couple of seasons in the mid 80s in dunks per game. It's not really an officially reported stat, but he did lead the league in dunks per game. And that caught my attention as, a young teenager at the time. His athleticism, he was just very active, very mobile for his size. He had an unusual versatility in his role on the team. He could play the 3, the 4, and the 5 positions, and he spent a lot of time in all 3. Just no conscience on offense. He earned the nickname Tommy Gun. He was just firing up shots from all over the court. And those shots were high degree of difficulty shots. He wasn't like, say, a Larry Bird that could really create a shot. And Larry Bird really was a unicorn in that ability. But Tom Chambers often had some really difficult scenarios that he worked with and put up some high degree of difficulty shots. And maybe a couple other images would be this spitfire intensity when he played. He was dead serious out there, hyper competitive. He wanted to beat you. And I think that's why he rarely smiled or laughed when he was on the court, because he wanted to win. He was just intense on the court, hyper competitive. And maybe a couple more things to wrap it up. I think he had a really nice mid-range jumper, 15 foot. He especially loved the jumper along the baseline. And he was an early adopter of the three-point shot as a regular weapon in his arsenal. And that was unusual for a big man in his era. and then just in general, kind of it's a different note, but I also think of him as a player that had all this talent. He suffered some bad luck scenarios earlier on in his career, and I think a few snubs along the way, and I think that's affected his recognition and his legacy. We can get more into that today as we go along.
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points, Jeff, you just rattled off there. I mean, what jumps out to me is him being 6'10", 220 and playing the way he did in the 80s, because you kind of mentioned nowadays, I don't know if we'd be that impressed by a Tom Chambers, but we have to remember in the 80s through the mid-90s, this was not a typical power forward. Being 6'10" and dunking over people the way he did athletically, that was really not seen at that time. Shooting outside, I mean, you know, younger people today might look at his three-point percentage and see, okay, it's 31%. But back then, I mean, that was shooting in the low 30s% in the early 80s when the three-point line was still relatively new. That was very good. And for a big man, a 6'10" guy shooting that, I mean, those people didn't attempt 1 or 2 threes a season. And he was shooting at a very high clip again, early on as a 6'10" guy. And I will say, Jeff, when I was watching your videos, I grew up knowing about Tom Chambers, and Jeff, my instinct of Tom, and we'll probably talk about this a little later, but he was for the longest time the only guy with over 20,000 career points that wasn't in the Hall of Fame. A few people have joined him since then, but he was for a very long time, my whole childhood, the only guy doing that. And I was always, when I was I was reading books back then, this was even pre-internet, but I was always like, who is this Tom Chambers guy? He had 20,000 career points. Why do I not know more about him? And again, as I become an adult, now I can go back and watch highlights all the time or watch full games all the time when he was on the Sonics or the Suns and all of that. I see this fluid, ahead of his time big man who was throwing reverse dunks down. And you telling me he led the league in dunks per game a few seasons, that really blows my mind. Because when I'm thinking the 80s, when I'm thinking dunkers, I'm thinking Dominique Wilkins, I'm thinking of MJ. In early 80s, I'm thinking of Dr. J. I am not first thought thinking of Tom Chambers. And if that dunk stat is true, which I know it is because you're telling me it right now, that is shocking to me. But I think that is a testament to how athletic this big man was and how he was really the only big man out there, I think, that could, I will say, I'm thinking about right now in my head, a 6'10" guy that could shoot a three and take it to the hole with that level of authority. I don't know if anyone else existed in the 80s that could really do that. I mean, Bill Laimbeer and Sigma, they could shoot from outside for a big man. That was rare. It was kind of these three, but they couldn't go to the hole like Chambers. So I do feel, I think unicorn gets thrown around a lot today, but I do feel like for his time, there really wasn't anyone quite like him in the NBA.
No, there wasn't. And I look at him with the passage of time and the perspective that we have now and how the league has evolved as a pioneer in that, what we call the stretch four today.
Yep.
So I look at players like, say, Dirk Nowitzki, kind of built on what Chambers had done earlier. Giannis, building on both of those guys. He kind of led an evolution. And I think at some level, his playing style irritated some of the coaches or even executives because it was so unlike what other big men his size were supposed to be doing. It was very positionful league in the 80s. You were 6'10", 6'11", you were going to be primarily a power forward or a center, and you're going to be confined to low post range. And he defied that. And I think part of it's just his Tommy gun mentality, but it was his skill set that just didn't land on his lap. He worked to develop that skill set. Yeah.
So, Jeff, I do want to move to our next segment here. We call this That Memorable Moment. That Memorable Moment is brought to you by StatHead. StatHead is the industry standard for finding and analyzing the statistical history of your favorite sport. Whether it be hockey, basketball, baseball, or football, StatHead is here for all of your statistical needs. It's used by front offices, journalists, but most of all, fans love it. I know Pot of Fame uses it for every single episode. I would be lost without it. I can compare across different time periods, different seasons, compare players across, 4 or 5 different ones across certain timelines, I can really do anything I want with StatHead. If you enjoy sports, I highly would recommend subscribing to StatHead. Go to stathead.com to get a subscription for either a single sport or all sports for the next year. It's worth your time. All right, let's go back to the pod. And what we do here in that memorable moment, it's very liberal segment. You can pick a certain play Tom Chambers had, his most memorable play, his most memorable game, playoff series, an entire season. It can be really anything. But to you, what is Tom Chambers' most memorable moment?
For me as a super fan, there is no one memorable moment, because I think if I name one moment, I'm pigeonholing him into one category. So since it's liberal here, I'm going to choose liberal. 3 that I think are very representative. These are the big three that come to my mind.
I love it. Go for it.
Every time. So I'll do them in chronological order, so it kind of lays out a trajectory. But the first is the 1987 All-Star Game. In my opinion, having lived through that era, that was peak golden age NBA. You had Magic and Bird both at their primes. You had Michael Jordan early prime. It was tearing up the league with 37 points per game. You had Dr. J in his final All-Star game. You had Moses Malone, another legend who still had All-Star years in him. Kevin McHale, Alex English, Akeem Olajuwon, Kareem. Both squads were stacked, and I believe somewhere around half of those players are now in the Hall of Fame.
Jeff, real quick, I have the numbers here. 10 members of the Eastern Conference team are in the Hall of Fame. 6 of the West are in the Hall of Fame. So 16 of the All-Stars that year are in the Hall of Fame. I don't know if that's the record, but it's got to be close.
It's got to be close. That whole era was just so stacked, and it was such an exciting time to be an NBA fan. So here Tom Chambers is. He was not initially put on that All-Star squad. Ralph Sampson, who was a starter on that squad, was injured. Chambers, the Sonics were at above 500 winning percentage at the time for the first time in a couple of years. And Chambers had some pretty decent numbers, 23, 7, and 3.5 assists. He was next in line. So Pat Riley, who was the coach of the West team, called him up, and not only called him up, but named him as a starter. And Pat Riley said, I'm not going to get booed by not starting Tom Chambers. This game was played in Seattle in the Kingdome. So I think it was the second most attended All-Star game in history at that point. Huge crowd, CBS Sports there covering it, the stage, and Chambers starts the game. And he starts off a little tight. I think he missed his first 3 or 4 shots. Magic had worked out with Chambers ahead of the game. I'm going to make you MVP. You are the man in this game. And that's what we ended up seeing in the game. Chambers found his groove, especially in the second half, finishes the game with 34 points, 4 steals, including 2 3-point shots with Larry Bird guarding him. The game goes to overtime with some clutch free throws by Rolando Blockman. It was just such a dramatic finish to a game. And Chambers walks away with the MVP among that lot of players in front of his hometown, in front of one of the largest crowds in history. And I think it represented his coming out party as a player, that he was on the elite stage and could hold his own, showed what he could do, his versatility. And that was such an exciting time for me because I watched that game live. And that really Tom Chambers from that point on was no doubt my favorite player. So that would be number one. And I do want to add that I think that sets some momentum for the Seattle Supersonics, because Chambers ended up having a really fantastic regular season, but was even more impressive in the postseason. He stepped up his game. They knocked out the Dallas Mavericks, who were forecasted to be one of the finalist contenders in the West. I think they were a 55-win team. Seattle Supersonics came in with barely a 500 record, knocked them out 3-1. Chambers dropped 31 in the closeout game. Then they met the Houston Rockets in the 87 playoffs. They were the defending Western Conference champions, Olajuwon, Sampson. Chambers had games of 37 and 38 in that series, closed them out. So this was kind of this situation where Chambers was really establishing himself and found a system that could work with him. Second thing that comes to mind, that moment, is what I call the dunk. It's the play where he's on the fast break. Kevin Johnson feeds him the ball as Chambers is coming down, takes one step into the key and flies up over Mark Jackson, who's trying to take the charge. Chambers collides with Mark Jackson with his knees in Mark Jackson's chin and neck and glides over Mark Jackson, flushes it with a two-hand dunk. And keep in mind that those kinds of dunks, those contact dunks, they're often finished with one hand because you're really trying to extend. Chambers did it with two. Jackson spins and falls to the floor. The Phoenix Suns crowd goes crazy. The Suns were down at that point. The New York Knicks were a rising team from the East, so this was no pushover team. And that play not only just was like the energizer for the Phoenix Suns to go on to win that game, but it symbolized a whole season for both Chambers and the Phoenix Suns. And I did a whole video on this called The Story of the Dunk, where that dunk symbolized the season. The Phoenix Suns had been in a total disarray due to drug scandals, and they had some player deaths, accidental deaths, really in shambles. Chambers came in that season as the first ever unrestricted free agent signing by the Phoenix Suns in league history. He was the man on that team, unquestionably. He finished in the top 10 in MVP voting that season. The Phoenix Suns, I think, became a 55-win team that season. They went all the way to the Western Conference Finals that season, the greatest single-season turnaround at the time. And that dunk symbolized more than just one spectacular play. It was like a rising from the ashes for a team, a literal phoenix rising from the ashes. And I think it was kind of a rising of Tom Chambers' career now really coming through. And the last one that comes to my mind is his 60-point game. Now, I look at that game, which came on March 24th, 1990, following season. I think it was his peak moment as an individual player. I think it showed his potential had been fulfilled, being in the right system with the right players around him that made him better, and then the system that played together that made the team better. He had a complete game along with that. It was 60 points, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 blocks. He didn't even play the full game. It didn't require an overtime. There was no 3-point shot made. He did try to attempt one, but his toe was on the line. And he did it at age 30. And you look at the players who have scored 60 or more points in a game, and throughout the entire NBA, few have done it at 30 or over. So this really was a testament that he had some game in him all along, but it was really late prime that it was fully exploited in that Suns system. And I think it exemplified the caliber of player he was. And it was no fluke. A month earlier, he had scored 56 against the Warriors. He had multiple 40-point plus games that season. This was the kind of player he was. He just needed to find the right system. But those would be the big three when I think of most memorable moments and how it encapsulates his career.
Jeff, that was excellent. I have a few notes, but you honestly covered everything perfectly down. Only other notes I want to say that Chambers dunk you talked about on Mark Jackson, that is definitely in the conversation for being on. I love doing Rushmores on this show. I try to do them all the time. That's definitely in play for in-game dunk Mount Rushmore. It's one of the best dunks I've ever seen. It's up there with, Sean Kemp dunking on a few different people. I think Shaq embarrassing Dudley's on there. Vince Carter's got a couple on there for me, but that is right in the conversation. And Jeff mentioned he had a video on that dunk. I watched it last night in preparation for this. It is well worth your time. Go watch that. So it's a quick plug for you, Jeff, for that video because it's excellent.
Thank you.
And then the 60-point game. I want to go back to this one more time. So I want everyone to understand listening today that Chambers dropping 60 on March 24th in 1990 on his former team, how big of a deal that is. I feel like in today's NBA with all the threes, it's a little high. Like it's a little easier to score 60 nowadays than it was back then. I'm just going to say that. When Chambers did that, he was only the 14th player in NBA history to drop 60 in a game. It's a very exclusive club. Only 14 people in NBA history at that point had done it. And they're all like all-time greats, all-time Hall of Famers, like Elgin Baylor, Wilt Chamberlain, MJ, all those guys. So he's the 14th ever to drop 60. As of today in 2022, still only 31 players have done it. And again, if we look back at the 90s, think of all the all-time greats that were in the 90s. The only people to drop 60 that entire decade was Karl Malone, MJ, and David Robinson, which are all, I would say, top 30. David Robinson is probably my top 25. So top 25 players of all time. So it's those three in Chambers. So I just want everyone to fully appreciate the company that Chambers is in here. Dropping 60, even today, it's still extremely hard, but there's names on that list nowadays, like Kemba's dropped 60, Gilbert Arenas has dropped 60, Karl-Anthony Towns have dropped 60. And again, nothing against those guys. It's still extremely hard, but the three-point line helps out quite a bit. Scoring 60 prior to the three-point boom really, really meant something. It means you were an elite scorer. You do not stumble into a 60-point game. You don't fall into that. You don't get lucky one game. And as you said, Jeff, he dropped 56 earlier that season. So he was one of the premier scorers in the league that could really go off. And that 60-point performance really should stand out as this guy was one of the better scorers during the time he played. And I just want to make sure everyone appreciates that, because it really does stand out as, hey, Chambers was that guy back then.
Exactly. And one other thing to keep in mind, especially for the younger fans, is that the NBA's offensive flow has been tweaked with over the decades since then to create a higher degree of offense. There was a time in the 90s where things slowed down so much the NBA really had to relax some of the rules. Hand checking eventually went away. Physical contact was reduced, especially down low. So Chambers was doing that 60-point game and his 56-point game in an era where it was really more difficult to do it with the kind of defenses that teams could throw on a player. And he was doing it against a team that was one of the top defensive teams in the league. He had, I think the Sonics threw on him Michael Cage, who was a pretty tough guy at one point, Derek McKee, who is a great defensive player. And he scored his 60th point on Sean Kemp, who was a rookie at that time, but Sean Kemp wasn't going to take that crap. He wanted to stop Tom Chambers. He wanted to try to block the shot. So Chambers was doing this against players who were legitimate defenders, not pushovers, not against, say, a Clippers team, but against his former team. And that just really highlights the story of just kind of this payback to a team that let him go for nothing.
No, it really does. So, Jeff, moving on to our next segment, we call this And Twins.
Love quarterbacks eating dirt, pom-poms and short skirts, fans who won't quit, and those twins.
And what we try to do here is we look at the Hall of Fame today, we look who's already in, and we say who is the closest to being Tom Chambers' twin. This could be style of his play. It can be statistical. It can really be anything you want. As long as you think a player in the Hall of Fame already reminds you of him and this player is already in the Hall of Fame, that player counts here. So who would you say Chambers' twin is?
Well, I'm going to take a couple of liberties here. I think of Chambers as a member of a fraternal triplet family. And there are a couple players who are in that I think remind me both of his playing style, his role on the teams he was on, his athleticism, but also his career numbers. And the first of the players that I want to talk about is James Worthy, who Chambers had quite a rivalry with James Worthy. They played against each other a number of times a year since they were both in the Western Conference for their careers. Worthy is an outstanding player, every bit deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. He was also in the NBA's top 50 team for their 50th anniversary. He's just recently was on the 75th anniversary team, 7-time All-Star, 3 championships with the Lakers. But in that career, with all those accolades, he only made 2 All-NBA third teams. And he wasn't even the best player on the Lakers team. I think he started out maybe third or fourth best, but worked himself up to number 2 late in Kareem's career. But he fit that system like a glove. And he was so lucky to have been drafted by the Los Angeles Lakers because his game style and his talents meshed with that system so well that he was able to connect right away and flourish. And I see elements of Tom Chambers and James Worthy. Tom Chambers, I would argue, was a more skilled player overall and would present more of a challenge for matchups for other teams. But for most of the first half of Chambers' career, he wasn't in a system that played to his abilities. He didn't fit in like a glove. He was drafted by a Clippers team, and this was a Donald Sterling Clippers team. This was a team that was always in a disarray, poorly managed, didn't court players, didn't develop them. As soon as their contracts came up, they were out because Sterling wasn't going to pay him to stay. That was where he started. And that team was trying to be built around Bill Walton. And I think Bill Walton, in the first 2 years of Chambers' career there, Bill Walton didn't play one whole season and played 32 games the next. So Chambers wasn't going to fit in there. He wasn't going to win. And then he went to the Seattle Supersonics, where he got paired up with what I call a legacy team. The nucleus of their 79 championship team by 1983 had Jack Sikma, who was still in prime, Gus Williams, who was late or just past prime, Freddie Brown, who was a great shooter, and still coached by Lenny Wilkins, who coached the 79 championship team. Chambers was not going to immediately make an impact on that nucleus. And that was a set half-court team. And Chambers' natural instinct was run and gun, just like James Worthy's was. And I'll point out a couple more things in this comparison. And again, I am not arguing that James Worthy shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, because he absolutely should, that he didn't deserve the accolades that he got. He absolutely did. But when we're comparing another player, I think we need to put it in a little more perspective. Worthy's career was pretty short. He was out of the league at age 32. And just to recap, in 90, I think he was still an all-star in 90 or 91. By 92, he was out of the league. In the 92 season, he played 80 games. These are his numbers. Just a hair over 40% from the field, 74% from the line, 2.3 rebounds, 1.9 assists, and 10.2 points per game. Chambers at age 32, he was still starting. He was his shooting had fallen off. He was at 40.437 for his field goal, 83% from the line, 5.8 rebounds, 2.1 assists, and 16.3 points per game. So Chambers lasted longer than James Worthy. James Worthy had the luck of being in a system that exploited his talents. Magic Johnson made him better. Pat Riley made him better. The players that he was surrounded by made him better. And we saw a little bit of that when Chambers finally landed on Phoenix late prime, and he was paired up with Kevin Johnson, Jeff Hornacek, Eddie Johnson, Dan Marley. It's kind of like a poor man's Showtime. And then Chambers just blew up, but that was late career, but the talent was there. So I don't think anyone could make an argument in good faith that, and I'm going to take Bill Simmons' argument here. Bill Simmons wrote in his book of basketball this idea about swapping Chambers and Worthy on the Lakers and San Diego Clippers. Let's just walk down that line for just a moment, line of thought. I don't think anybody in good faith could argue that if Chambers was traded to the Lakers in 82, because the Lakers needed a shooting guard and they needed a young forward to complement Kareem. Let's just say the Clippers in 82 wanted that number 1 pick to get James Worthy. They shipped off Chambers. They shipped off Al Wood, who was also a pretty darn good young shooting guard, traded them and their first round pick, which became Terry Cummings, shipped those guys to the Lakers. San Diego Clippers got James Worthy. I don't think anybody in good faith could argue that Chambers was so inferior to Worthy that the Lakers would not have gone on to win 3 more titles, and Chambers couldn't have won at least 1 finals MVP given his skill sets. I think the Celtics would have a tough time matching up with Chambers. Anytime Chambers played the Celtics in his prime, they really had a difficult matchup. He was too quick for McHale, too quick and big for Bird. He was a defensive liability more so than James Worthy was, but I think he would have given the Lakers more dynamic offense and freed up Kareem and Rambis and Green down low. But so James Worthy is one of his twins. The other one, a little bit tougher to think of, but I think there's some similarities here, is Chris Bosh. I think Chris Bosh, being a similar size, Chris Bosh was billed at 6'11". I've met Chambers. He's definitely on the high side of 6'10". I think he's more 6'11", and he was billed at 6'11" early in his career, but I think he downsized it, possibly to not get pigeonholed as being a 4 and 5. But anyway, Chris Bosh, 6'11". He made 11 all-star teams, and I'm going to just put a caveat here. On those 11 all-star teams early on, at least 2 or 3 of them were on when he was playing on a team that was well under 500. I think his first all-star team, his team was 27-55. There wasn't much to pick from in the East, but he was a good, solid player. He had a decent mid-range shot. He was skilled around the basket. He was a marginally better shot blocker, a better defender than Chambers, marginally better rebounder, fewer assists than Chambers, given the minutes he was playing. I see some similarities, definitely athletic, definitely a stretch 4. But when he went to the Heat and he really got some accolades there, won some rings, he was only a third best player on the team. And, if anyone compared to Dwayne Wade and LeBron James, yeah, you're going to be the third best player, but it wasn't like he was the man. So he continued his all-star streaks despite being the third best player. But I think there's some similarities. And I'll say one more point about this comparison with Bosh. I think there's similarities, but given all the playoffs that Bosh had in his career, which there were a lot compared to Chambers. Chambers in 1989, throughout the entire playoffs that one year, which went all the way to Western Conference Finals, averaged 26, 11, and 4 in the 89 playoffs, going all the way to the Western Conference Finals. And he was the man. Bosh, on the other hand, despite all of his playoffs, his single series bests at any point in his entire career, just picking out the best scoring average, the best rebounding, and best assists, was 24, 10, and 3.6. So Chambers did step it up when he was even in late prime. But I see a lot of similarities. Chris Bosh is definitely a Hall of Famer. You can't argue with 11-time All-Star and a couple of rings on top of that. But I see those two guys as his fraternal brothers.
I mean, I think those are excellent points. The whole time you're talking about Worthy, all I could think about is subbing Chambers into that gold uniform and seeing how he performed. And, I think everyone that plays with Magic Johnson benefited. And I was reading something the other day, Jeff, kind of preparing for this. They were talking about Tom Chambers winning that All-Star MVP you talked about earlier. And they're like, a big reason why is because he had Magic Johnson distributing to him. And that was in one All-Star game. He had Magic as the point guard. And he dropped 34. Him on those Laker teams. Again, I don't want to say anything bad against James Worthy because James Worthy is a Hall of Famer. I don't foresee a drop-off at all if you swap out Worthy with Chambers. If anything, Chambers is just longer and has a little more of an outside shot than Worthy ever had, and was a better rebounder than Worthy was. Worthy did play small forward on those teams. You said Chambers kind of fluctuate between them, and I feel like he was athletic enough to definitely play small forward. But I definitely see that change up. And, Bosh too, I get that. And really when it comes down to, if you're having this conversation with someone with Bosh, Worthy, and Chambers, I already know where their head's going because my head went there too. It's Bosh had 2 rings, Worthy had 3 rings, and Chambers didn't. He made one finals in 93 with the Suns. He made plenty of Western Conference finals, but he never won the ring. And that's held against a lot of people, fairly or not. And you already made the point that, it wasn't a fault of his. He was, dropping 25, 26 points a game and rebounding at a high level. But still, the rings thing will always come up in conversation. And in terms of like skill level, though, and how talented they were, you brought up Worthy made, I think, 2 All-NBA third teams where Chambers made 2 All-NBA seconds. Bosh only made All-NBA once. He made all those All-Star teams you talked about, but I don't want to knock the Eastern Conference either, but like Jamal McGlure made an All-Star team one year on the Hornets when Bosh was making it, right? The East wasn't a powerhouse in the 2000s there, but Bosh made 1 All-NBA team, and there was 3 teams when he was playing the whole time. Chambers, there was no third team during most of the 80s there. So Chambers All-NBA wise beats out both Worthy and Bosh statistically because he played longer, and honestly, his points per game was up there. He had more points than all those guys. it's the ring. The rings are what separates those from Chambers. And unfairly or not, and the Hall of Fame cares about that. That's the big difference I see. The way they played, I think, is very similar. Their numbers are very similar. They're all NBA. We already said Chambers has the edge there. It's really the championships. And to the Hall of Fame, that does matter. But from a ability standpoint, Chambers is right there with them. I don't want to say one's better than the other right now, but he's right there with them.
Right. And I'm going to, continue to take some liberties here. There was one other player that came to my mind, and I'm sure he's going to be a shoe-in first ballot Hall of Famer this year, and that's Dirk Nowitzki. I think he most closely resembles an evolved version of Tom Chambers. I always refer to Dirk as Chambers 2.0. He was a little bigger. He was better at ball handling. He had even more range on his shot and really used that range. He made mismatch problems like crazy for the defensive. He improved upon the mold that Chambers had set earlier. And he went on to win a ring and an MVP. And it just makes me wonder what Chambers could have done had he been drafted on a team early on where they valued him, they wanted him, they invested in him, they exploited his abilities, they didn't reject him being all over the court. And lastly, the last point I want to make here, because it was brought up a little bit earlier, and I think it ties in a little bit with Dirk Nowitzki and then also differentiates Chambers from Bosch and Worthy. He had a podcast on Bill Laimbeer not long ago, and it's a great podcast. I love the arguments being made about his career. It was really compelling. But it was a point brought up in that conversation that Bill Laimbeer and Jack Sikma were really the earliest adopters for the three-pointer as a regular weapon in their arsenal, and they were respectably good at it, and I agree with that. But as I'm listening to it, I kind of winced a little bit because I just said to myself, that's not true. Chambers was the first. And this is a fact that Chambers was the first player standing 6'10" or taller to average at least 1 3-point attempt per game for a full season. And I put together some stats here to really illustrate to you and your audience here the differences. So Bill Laimbeer first attempted at least 1 3-point shot a season in the 88-89 season. For his career, he made 619 attempts, 202 makes for a career field goal percentage at the three at 32.6. Now get this. Jack Sikma also made his first 1 attempt per game average in the 88-89 season, same as Laimbeer. Their stats are almost identical. 618 career attempts, 203 makes for a career average of 32.8, virtually identical. But get this, here's Tom Chambers. First attempted 1 a game in the 86-87 season, 2 full seasons earlier, and he attempted 1.8 per game, just under 2 per game. For his career, 740 attempts, 227 makes for a career average of 30.7%. And in that 86-87 season, his first ever attempting more than 1 a game, he hit 37.2%. which is still respectable for a 6'10" or taller big man today. So he really was the first. So I got a little annoyed when I heard I couldn't think of anyone else to mention, but that's just, it's emblematic of Chambers' career, how often he's left off of the conversation or how often he isn't referenced or appreciated.
No, I mean, you got me there, Jeff. You have the facts. And to be honest, you're right. And the only defense I think I would give myself in that is when we were talking in my head, right? All I was doing was thinking of a center. That's all I was doing, right? Laimbeer's a center, Sikma's a center. I was trying to think of centers. Chambers was a power forward, and he was the same height as these guys. But to me, Chambers has always been, as we talked about earlier, right? This fluid guy who could drive to the hoop and throw down dunks. When I'm thinking of Sikma, when I'm thinking Laimbeer, when I'm thinking of 1980s big men, I'm not thinking of that style of play. So that's my only defense. And again, that's a testament to Chambers being this kind of first of his kind, right? Like I think of him, like for instance, when I think of Kevin Durant today, I do not think of a 7-footer. Kevin Durant is 7 feet tall. I do not think of a 7-footer. I think of a guy who can play inside, outside, who almost plays like a guard or what a small forward used to play like, that's Kevin Durant to me. He's not a big man, but he's 7 feet. Chambers, and again, I want to be clear to people listening, I'm not comparing Chambers to Durant. I'm just trying to make a point here. But Chambers was 6'10", 6'11", but to me in the 80s, he was not this big man. He was this swing man that could go inside, could go outside, could pop out, and he was super athletic. And I think, again, when I was, maybe I just totally blew it with the Chambers comment, but I think in my head, I was strictly thinking at the time, Jeff, like, who were the centers back then? Those big guys who were down low, who were banging down low, who shot from outside. And I think that's where my head was. I think Chambers, again, this kind of uniqueness, he was so different from everyone else at the time. I think it just probably slipped out of my hands as well as my guest, because my guest was very informed on all of that as well. So thank you for calling us out there. I think that's a completely fair statement. And you did the homework there. It was 2 seasons earlier. So I love all of those stats there. That was excellent.
Fair enough. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And the interesting thing is that once Chambers had left the Sonics, he was often matched up against Jack Sikma, because the Phoenix Suns would throw small ball in there and Chambers would be playing against Sikma and vice versa. And Chambers relished playing against Bill Laimbeer because Chambers could take Laimbeer off the dribble almost every time. And so you'd see the Pistons throwing Rodman first on Chambers to get Chambers flustered and tangled up, and then he'd match up with Bill Laimbeer. But I get your point. Those guys were pretty much solid 5s, spent some time in the 4 position. And I get your point. Chambers, yeah, I agree too. I would not think of Chambers first as a center. I see him as more of an active player. And I think your example of Kevin Garnett and even a Kevin Durant, for that matter, you don't think of them as 7-footers because of their active playing style.
Yeah. So I do want to get to our final segment here, Jeff. We call this Court.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
And this is kind of where we talk about, what are the main pros, what are the main cons for his Hall of Fame candidacy. And again, we've been talking about a lot of the pros throughout. So I will want to get to at some point, why is he still on the outside looking in? Why is he not getting voted? Why was he just a nominee recently? Because he wasn't a nominee all these other years. But where I want to start in the pro side still. And there's a couple of things we haven't talked about yet in depth that I want to get to. So I mentioned in the beginning, I knew who Tom Chambers was at a very early age, even though I was really too young to understand what was going on in the NBA. He retired in 98. I was 8 years old. But I used to read, of course, I was obsessed with sports history. I would read everything I could get my hands on. And 20,000 points to me was like 3,000 hits as a kid. It was, to me, that's an automatic Hall of Famer. If you get to 20,000 points, you're one of the best players to ever play the game. That was, as a kid, that was what I thought. And I was always like, oh my God, there's these great players that didn't even make it to 20,000. Magic Johnson didn't make it to 20,000. Like, some people just got over 20,000. So that was my number. And I always would see Tom Chambers at the very tail end of it because he had 20,049 career points. And I would be like, why do I not know more about this guy? And also I was like, why is he not in the Hall of Fame? As I grew older, I still thought that. Why is this guy not in the Hall of Fame? And over time, a few other people, he's falling farther and farther down the list as more and more greats come through the league, as one would expect. But he still sits at 48th all time today. And there's only 4 players, including Tom, that are past that mark that I think, aren't guaranteed Hall of Famers. Everyone else, that's, even if they're active today, like, for example, Steph Curry is right ahead of Tom Chambers now. I think he's like 50 points higher than Chambers right now. But like LaMarcus Aldridge is at 20,558. Joe Johnson's right behind him at 20,407. Chambers then is at 48 with 20,049. Antoine Jameson's at 20,042. Everyone else above is a clear-cut first ballot guy. These are the 4 guys on the outside looking in. And honestly, LaMarcus Aldridge and Joe Johnson haven't even been eligible to be nominated yet. Only Antoine Jameson has. My question to you, Jeff, and I'm curious here. One, do you think the 20,000 point club, do you think that matters? And two, do you think that should automatically get you in the Hall of Fame? And before you answer, I will say for the longest time, I did think 20,000 should be automatic. I thought it was a 3,000 hit club type of deal. However, as offense, as you said earlier, it's easier to play offense now. Scoring's higher. People are dropping more points at the 3-point line. Obviously, if Chambers played today, he'd average 7 or 8 threes a game. I know that, maybe more. It's just easier to score points. And with Jamison sneaking on there, I don't think Jamison should be in the Hall of Fame. I also don't think Joe Johnson should be in the Hall of Fame. So I think now I almost want to move that bar back to 21,000 because everyone else is in. Now, Chambers did that early on. So when he did it, I thought it should. Now, because offense is easier, I feel like it needs to be pushed back to 21,000. So I want to get your take, I guess, on this. Do you think 20,000 is this 3,000 hit type deal where if you pass it, you should get in? Do you feel like I do, where when Chambers passed it, it was kind of this holy grail? Now it needs to be extended. Just want to know where your head's at on this.
I don't think 20,000 points in a career today means as much as it did prior to the year 2000. Chambers was only the 20th player in league history to reach that milestone. So there's 19 players ahead of him in the year 1995. NBA is almost 50 years old at that point. So like he did in his 60-point game, he was joining an exclusive club of basketball royalty. And some of those 20,000 point scorers are combining with their ABA years. And the ABA, you could really rack up some points if you were a really talented star player. But as I said, the offensive flow in the game has been tweaked over the years because the NBA, when it comes down to it, is entertainment. And the league is not going to stand for a game that isn't as entertaining. So it has relaxed some defensive rules that make it easier for a player to get a lot of points in a game. And of course, the adoption of 3-point helps, but also the player's longevity has been extended over the years. There was a time in the 80s and even into the 90s where there was a number that announcers would often mention, 32. A talented player's career, really, when they hit 32, that's when things go downhill. You don't see that so much anymore with the top end players. Here you got Steph Curry. Was he 34 in this recent finals playing the way he did? That was almost unseen except for maybe 1, 2, or 3 players back in Chambers' era. So players' careers were longer. They're better training, better nutrition, better management of playing time. Now the NBA is creating more time in between games, so there's not so many back-to-backs. I think all this helps, and I agree with you. Maybe in our minds, we should be thinking that 21,000 now is kind of the automatic goal, or 22,000. It's 20,000 today is not what it used to be. But I think, in this whole discussion and what the case I'm going to make in court here, I'm not arguing that Chambers is a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame. I'm arguing that he is not just a borderline case. I think he should be the line. I think he's right on the line. And again, I'm going to borrow from Bill Simmons here. I think writes great stories about basketball and has just this mind to put players' careers in perspective. Bill Simmons basically argued that Chambers should be the bar that every other player should clear to get in the Hall of Fame. In other words, was this player, whoever is under consideration, was this player better than Tom Chambers? And I agree with that. I think Chambers should be the defining line because the Hall of Fame is not what we think it should be. It's not what we want it to should be. And I don't think we should be arguing from that perspective. I think we should be arguing in perspective. Who's already in there? What kind of players have gotten in there that maybe not in our minds we thought are that caliber Hall of Fame talent? And who should be the dividing line? I think Tom Chambers would be a great case. He's like the last significant star from that golden age of the NBA that achieved some of those things we've talked about before, and an iconic play to boot that people still remember. He should be that defining line. The Hall of Fame doesn't, other than being retired for 5 years. I think
I love the Tom Chambers line here. I love the sound of that. That sounds great, and I think that was very well put. One more thing I want to get to here, Jeff, before maybe we talk about some of the reasons why he's still on the outside looking in, why he's just being really nominated now, because he was nominated for the 2022 class, was not a finalist, but that was the first name his name had really come up, which is shocking to me. I want to talk about the area he played in. I think that's super important. I try to do this most podcasts, but I have this philosophy on my end. It's not foolproof. There's definitely flaws in it, but I usually look at a player and I go, how did he rank among his contemporaries at the position during the time he played? And I always feel like if someone was a top 5 player at their position during the decade, not that they should be in the Hall of Fame, but they should be in the conversation. Like they're definitely in the ballpark of this makes sense to talk about him in this frame. And sometimes there's more than 5 Hall of Famers at a position in a decade. The centers in the 90s, there's tons of Hall of Famers there. So sometimes it doesn't work. Other times there's not as much talent. It doesn't work as much, but it gives me a sense of stability when I'm trying to think through this. So I was looking at the power forwards of the 80s. And I was thinking where Tom Chambers, and I know Tom Chambers played in 98, but and again, he made 2 All-Star teams in the 90s. He had that, some of his best seasons, actually, I guess that 90s season where he averaged 27 a game, but I still think of him as an 80s guy. I think his better seasons were there. And when I'm thinking of the power forwards, so Karl Malone, he's more of a 90s guy, to be honest. So I kind of throw him out of the 80s. He only, he played a majority of his career, of course, in the 90s. So I kind of throw him out of the conversation just so people at home know I'm not forgetting about him. I keep Barkley in there because he made 4 All-NBA teams in the 80s. So I have Barkley as kind of the top dog. I have Kevin McHale. And then there's this mix where I basically have Chambers at 3. The only competition here, and Jeff, I want to know if you rank any of these guys above Chambers. So I have Barkley, McHale, and then there's this flux of Chambers, Larry Nance, Terry Cummings, and Buck Williams. Do you think Chambers is better than all 3 of those guys, Nance, Cummings, and Buck Williams?
Yes, unequivocally. And that's not to disparage any of those players because they did have some talents that Chambers did not. Buck Williams and Chambers matched up a lot. And I've seen so many games where those 2 guys were scrapping at each other. Technicals were called. Buck Williams was a better defender than Chambers, but I think Chambers' all-around game and skill set added more value to a team in his prime than Buck Williams did. Larry Nance, another great player, made a few all-star teams, terrific defensive player, very athletic like Chambers, terrific dunker, won the dunk contest in 84, I think. I just think Chambers' overall skill set added more value to a team and made him more dangerous to opposing teams.
Yeah, no, I agree. I have him slotted there with Nance following Cummings and then Buck. I love all those guys, though. I'm not going to lie. I'm a big fan of the 80s power forward. They're all a bit different, though, really, in their skill sets and what they brought to the table. But again, I feel like when I'm thinking of the case for Chambers, to me, this 3rd best power forward of a decade, and again, we're talking the 80s, extremely talented decade with so many all-time greats. That means something to me that he's in there. Again, Barkley and McHale are above him, and I'm not even questioning that, but he is kind of solidly in that 3rd position for me. And again, you could argue Karl Malone belongs in the 80s. That's fine. He's 4th best, whatever. But still, 3rd, 4th best in the decade. That is a very good place to be in my head in terms of should someone, be in the Hall of Fame or not, where were they in the context of the people playing during that time? And again, like his score, like McHale never scored at the level that Chambers did in Chambers' peak seasons. And that was partially because of the offense he played in and whatnot. And he was, better at a lot of other things maybe than Chambers was. But, 3rd in the 80s power forward ranking, I feel very good about. So, Jeff, I do want to shift to some of the things kind of being held against Chambers, maybe, and why he's not in today. Was there anything on a positive note you wanted to add before we maybe shift to the case against?
One more last thing to add on that comparison, and having seen literally hundreds of Tom Chambers games and matching up against other forwards, he routinely switched off between playing and starting as the small forward and the power forward. In game, if the team he was on wanted to switch to small ball, that's when he would typically play the 5. But he was often matching up against Dominique Wilkins, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, Orlando Woolridge. So, when you look at all the players that he was regularly matching up with, it really makes an interesting case, because Kevin McHale, for example, who I would put ahead of Chambers for sure, wasn't matching up with those guys so much. And I think that's a testament to Chambers' versatility and the kind of players he had to handle. And then maybe putting something, this could probably go into the next segment, Chambers was generally not as good a defender as those guys are.
Yeah. No, and also, not that this really matters for the context of this conversation about the Hall of Fame, but in Boston fans listening, do not murder me over this comment, but if you were to just drop Chambers into today's NBA versus dropping McHale into today's NBA, Chambers would do just fine. I think McHale would not be McHale. That's all I'll say. Chambers would fit in much better in today's NBA than McHale would. And that's just from a versatility, athletic standpoint and where the game's gone today. So, Jeff, shifting toward the case against, because obviously Chambers is not in. He's never been a finalist, and his name popped up as a nominee last year, and I was super excited about that, because I was like, how is this guy not constantly a nominee, if not finalist? Because if you really look, and it's going to sound kind of silly, but I'm going to say it, like, if you look at some of the people that get nominated every year, there's some players that get nominated every year for the Basketball Hall of Fame that I think really have no, like, they're fine players. I've done episodes on a couple of them, but they don't really have business being in the Hall of Fame. And someone I'll bring up, and I love him, and I've done an episode on him, and I think he was great for who he was. But like, Muggsy Bogues has been a nominee for the Hall of Fame several times. And when I was seeing his name come up and not Tom Chambers, I would always be very thrown off by that. I'll just say, and there's other players too. I don't want to go through all of them, but like, Chambers being nominated finally the other year is great, and I'm glad he's getting brought up more. But there's obviously a case against him, because he's never, he's not really been brought up much since he retired back in 98. So the main things I have against him, and we've talked about some of this, like we talked earlier, the big difference between him, Bosch, and Worthy, are he never won a finals. And that's true. He made to the finals in 93. He did make it, though, to 5 different Western Conference finals. In 3 of them, he was the best, if not the second best player. I mean, in back-to-back Western Conference finals for Phoenix in 89-90, averaged 25 points a game in those Western Conference finals, 10 boards in 89, 8 boards in 90. I mean, again, that's top-level production in one of the highest-level games. So, like, he was playing in big games. He's not someone like and again, I don't want to tarnish any of these people's names, but like Mitch Richmond's in the Hall of Fame. He really never would get out of the first round, second round with the teams he played on. T-Mac, even, who's an all-time great, one of my favorites, he was never going far in the playoffs. Chambers was in the Western Conference Finals 5 different times, in the finals once. He was in big games playing big roles, but again, never won the title. That does hurt. We talked about his 2 All-NBA teams, the second teams. That's good, and that's relative to a lot of people in the Hall of Fame today. If not, they have less, like, we talked about Worthy and Bosch already, but 4-time All-Stars, a little light. The one thing other than defense I want to talk about, Jeff, and I know you mentioned me at the beginning of this before we even started, you're not a big, or you don't get into the statistics and stuff like that as maybe other people I have on are, but when you look at advanced metrics, which I'm sure a lot of the younger voters are today, and voters are, using data more and more, that's where Chambers really falls off a cliff. And I was shocked by it, honestly, Jeff, when I looked at it and I double checked, because I was like, that does not seem right. But he really falls off a cliff when it comes to advanced metrics. And if you're a voter that really lives and dies by advanced metrics, and unfortunately, I think that's going to be more and more the case moving forward, Chambers really gets hurt here. His win shares per 48 is 0.112, which most Hall of Famers I usually see in the power forward are usually above like a 0.15. But what really kills him, and again, you can take it, listeners, you can take as much stock or as little in it, but with especially the MVP race this last year, a lot of people care about it. People talk about VORP all the time with who's going to be the MVP this year, Jokic or Embiid or Giannis. Value over replacement, or otherwise called VORP, was brought up all the time. And Jokic is just like a advanced metrics darling. He crushes on VORP. He was higher than them. People pointed to that. Other people are like, I don't care about VORP. That doesn't matter. Whatever you're thinking is, it's a statistic. It's there. There's a strong correlation between having an extremely high VORP and being in the Hall of Fame. But trust me, it doesn't mean everything. However, Chambers' VORP is like in an all-time low. He has a VORP of 12 for his career. 12 is 363rd all-time in NBA history. He's sandwiched between Brad Davis and Tyrone or Corbin. The point guard, many of you might remember from a few years ago, Brandon Jennings, who played for Milwaukee, who fell out of the league pretty quick. He's 2 spots behind. He's 2 spots behind Chambers here in terms of VORP. There's only one Hall of Famer with a lower VORP than him that wasn't selected by an international committee or something, and that's Ralph Sampson, who had a VORP of 5, so even much lower than him. And I think Ralph Sampson's mainly in because, he had a great all-time college career at Virginia, and then, of course, came to the NBA, had a few good years, but got hurt. But other than that, that is the thing where I'm shocked by how low it is. Jeff, if you ask me how do they calculate it exactly, I couldn't tell you. But I know in context, I look at Chambers, traditional stats I look at, games play I look at, all of that I think grades out very well. But when I look at this one advanced metric that, again, has a very strong correlation to being a good player, he is so low down all these players that don't even make sense. I consider him this just extreme outlier, but I do think that will get voters' attention. And if he doesn't get in the next 5 or 10 years and we get more and more consumed by advanced metrics, I think this might start to be a problem for him. I mean, what do you take of that? Have you heard that argument before? What are your thoughts there?
Oh, yeah, certainly I've heard the statistical argument, and I have also reviewed those statistics. I agree. He does appear to be this outlier that you wonder, is this Hall of Fame worthy? On paper, is this Hall of Fame worthy for this player? And I think an argument can be made that statistics are kind of like a spectrum. And in a spectrum, you're taking slices of color ranges. So each stat can look at a color range of a particular player's career and come up with a meaningful analysis. I'm looking at it more from the aspect of the time he played, what he did at his position, how that may have helped evolve the game. He still has most of the basic requisite career stats. But if he wasn't that good a player, he wouldn't have gotten the playing time. Coaches wouldn't have been talking about him. League executives wouldn't have rushed to get him on a team. He would not have been the man on important teams that got to the Western Conference Finals and eventually toppled the Lakers. So statistics definitely can expose a part of a player's weaknesses. And I'd say Chambers' biggest weakness was his liability on defense.
Yep.
He was such an offensive-minded person that his defense was often, I would say, uninspired. It came in fits. And sometimes he'd make a great block, and he was actually pretty decent at steals too, down low. But he was a defensive liability. And I think that can hurt him. And I think the other aspect to kind of flip the conversation around is, I don't really know who the voters are on the committee, but I do know a few of them. And I do know that there are a lot more former players who played in the 80s and 90s who are on that committee. And the committee is run by Jerry Colangelo, who was the man who wanted Chambers on the Phoenix Suns. He was the guy who made the deal to make Chambers the first unrestricted free agent signing in league history. I can't say that all of the voters on that committee are really breaking down the stats super hard, because some of them may actually be saying, you know what, Chambers was a damn tough cover. And look at where the league is now. And look at how he played then. And we didn't kind of know what to do with him, but now we know what it could have been done. I think with time and perspective, I think it's why he's showing up now. I think it's why he's going to be in the conversation. And I don't think it's going to be an easy vote for him, but I do think over time it's going to wear. It took like Jack Sikma 5 times. Tim Hardaway got in. That was multiple times. So I think having him come up for review and the passage of time and the kinds of people that might be on the committee now that played with him versus say, and I'm only speculating here, I'm thinking guys like Bill Bradley, Earl Monroe, a few of those older guys got on because the voters may have been New York Knicks fans and may have been sports writers that really had a liking for those guys. But now you might be getting a Gary Payton on there who played against Chambers and knew what a mismatch he was. So I think that would be my response to it. Stats are important. And some of those guys are definitely going to be looking at stats and saying, I think we got some better guys in this pool this year. Yeah. And there may be others who are looking at it like me, holistically and with the passage of time and perspective.
No, Jeff, I totally agree with you. So I do want to get to final verdict here. I ask all my guests, but I'm asking you as well. 2 questions here at the end, and then I'll answer. First question is, do you think Tom Chambers belongs in the Basketball Hall of Fame? And then the second question is, do you think he will get into the Basketball Hall of Fame?
I think the first question is kind of like asking a salesperson if they still want to
I gotta ask it. I do it every episode.
Yeah, of course. Of course. I think he belongs in the Hall of Fame, and I think he belongs in there for the cases that I laid out. He should be the line, the demarcation that future players need to clear. I think he meets the minimum general standards. And with the passage of time and looking what he did in his career and the kind of player he was, adds more value to him now, seeing where the league is now. So yes, I would vote him in for those reasons. The second question, I don't think it's going to happen soon. I think it's going to take repeated attempts, but I do believe, and part of it's going to be a bias on my part, since I'm such a fan of his and passionate, I do believe that over time, seeing his name coming up again and again and really taking a look, and the work I'm doing on my channel to kind of showcase his career and shed some light on a career that's been otherwise overlooked, I think that's going to work like osmosis and eventually get him in.
Okay. Well, I'm not too shocked by your answers. My answers, I do think he should be in. I'll be honest with you, Jeff, he's one of the more back and forths I did, and I've thought about Chambers for a while now, but I'll say 2 reasons why. One, I do think the 20,000 point club did matter when he got it. And I'm surprised he honestly wasn't kind of a shoe-in in the 2000s when it was still a very exclusive club. It's getting a little bigger now, but I think that still when he got there, that mattered. And then the bigger part to me is just how he compared to the other power forwards when he played. We talked about the All-NBA teams, right? He was playing power forward at the time. He was 2-time All-NBA second team. Kevin McHale only made 1 All-NBA team. Kevin McHale, one of the better power forwards I think we all think of, made 1 All-NBA team during that time period. James Worthy, another Hall of Famer, 2 All-NBA third teams. I'm looking at these guys that play in the same exact time. The voters were the same kind of people, and Chambers was looked upon as an All-NBA guy above a Kevin McHale and a Worthy. And that matters to me, and being the 3rd best power forward of a decade matters to me. So I do think he's going to get in. Do I think he'll ever get in? I do. The Basketball Hall of Fame to me is, out of the 3, the easiest one to get into by far. I'm actually shocked he's still on the outside looking in because of his accolades. I do see him getting in, and him being nominated last year, I hope, as you said, will bring him more to the front frame here where we really start looking through the numbers. The only thing that could maybe keep him out, again, voters keep getting younger. They really get locked into advanced metrics, kind of like the Baseball Hall of Fame is starting to get like. And this VORP thing and some of the box plus minus just completely throw him out of the conversation, which I do not think would be fair, but I think that's the only way he doesn't get in. So I do think he gets in. I'd say he gets in the next 10 years. By 2032, he's getting in the Hall of Fame. So those are my 2 answers. Jeff, so much fun having you on today. Real quick before you get out here, you want to plug your channel one more time?
Well, first, Jim, I want to say thank you for reaching out and inviting me on. I really enjoyed our chat today. For your audience, my channel is TC24 on YouTube, as in Tom Chambers 24. I've been using it to build an online library about Tom Chambers' career to showcase his highlights. I've got mixtapes, dunk mixtapes, feature stories on his career from high school through the pros, all the way to when he played in Israel. And I'm currently working on what I call the Greatest Game series. I'm taking tapes out of my extensive collection, digitizing them, and putting up the full game. I've edited it, I've cleaned it up, and I do my own personal intro for the game, talking about why this is one of his greatest games. And I'm doing that about twice a month. So come by TC24. I'm going to be doing this until I have nothing else to say. And I think that's going to be a long time.
Everyone, if you enjoyed today's podcast, go check out that channel. I was going to say, Jeff, that your channel is a supplement to this podcast, but really my podcast is just a supplement to your channel. You do great work. Everything we talked about and more can all be seen there in really well cut videos. So again, if you enjoyed this video game, please go check out Jeff's channel. Again, that's TC24 on YouTube. Jeff, really enjoyed the time today. We'll have to see what happens with Tom Chambers. But as we get, hopefully he gets further and further through the process, maybe becomes a finalist in the next couple of years. I think his name will be up more and more. And I'm sure I'll keep throwing this podcast out there when his name comes up and you'll keep producing videos. So hopefully eventually he does get in. And I feel like Tom Chambers should fly you out to the induction ceremony if he ever gets in, because I feel like your videos might have a big part to do with it.
Awesome. Thanks again. I really enjoyed this, and I'm in this for the long haul, and it sounds like you are too.
All right, Jeff, take care. Have a great weekend.
You too, Jim. Thank you.
All right. I want to thank Jeff again for coming on the podcast. I had a lot of fun talking about Tom Chambers. That is all we have for you today. If you don't already, please subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating review. Follow us at Twitter at Pod of Fame. And again, don't forget, we are sponsored by StatHead. Make sure you go to StatHead and take advantage of that $20 deal. Again, the promo code is FAME, and you get $20 off an annual subscription to StatHead. But again, that is all we have.